Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that's just all about some recent reads. I have not done a wrap up in the past couple of months, and so I just thought I would talk about some books here that I don't think I covered in vlogs. We're in a different location today because I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that I am currently in Taormina, Sicily. This is Isola behind me, which is a little island that you can walk to. And we're just sitting on the balcony. It is gorgeous weather. I thought I would take advantage of the gorgeous sea and scenery and just film this video here while I am thinking about it. I've actually finished some books on this vacation, but I have done a reading vlog while here in Sicily. So I just wanted to talk about a few of the books that I have recently read. The main one that I finished is a book that I have been reading for months and months, and that's Messalina. And this is a nonfiction about the wife of Emperor Claudius. I really wanted to get this finished before I came on this trip because I was visiting Rome again, and I thought I was going to get to go to the Domus Aurea, which is Nero's house, the golden house of Nero, but you have to schedule that way in advance, and they actually only do tours in English on the weekend, so I technically was not in Rome at the right time to go on a tour of the Domus Aurea. So that was unfortunate, but I kind of associate Messalina and Claudius with Nero because Claudius's wife, after Messalina, is Nero's mother. And I think this book has gotten a lot of hype, it's gotten a lot of buzz. It's a great nonfiction, it's really interesting in a narrative sense, but I'll be honest, I think this book left a lot to be desired in terms of actual scholarship on her. And it's a shame because I know this book was really working hard and working with a figure that I assume it was very difficult to get any in-depth information about. Women of the ancient world are just not as well documented, especially women like Messalina, who have come under fire and have been incredibly controversial in the past. They had their monuments destroyed at the time, so there's probably not a lot remaining that contextualizes anything about her personally anyway. But a lot of this book just spent time kind of talking about the age of Claudius, the age of Tiberius, which is pre-Claudius. It set up her life. It kind of talked around her a lot. It set up things to make you understand kind of her quality of life based on the class that she occupied. And that was interesting, and I do think that offered an insight into who Messalina probably was, but at the same time, that was really disappointing to me because, I don't know, I thought the book being about her, we were going to get something a little bit more interesting and a little bit more detailed actually about her. But again, I recognize the scholarship and the study of women historically, it's very difficult, particularly for the ancient Roman world, but it's difficult in general I would say Renaissance period. And even then it can be murky. Even into the 1800s, sometimes women's history can be fairly murky. So I recognize this was a really hard thing to do. And I think this book was incredibly well written. I think it was very approachable nonfiction. And I think it really did have a lot to say. And I think you can infer a lot about her personally just from how this book is laid out, and from how the author just discusses larger topics and larger ideas of the time period. I think you can infer from that kind of who Messalina was. And I think it's interesting because I don't know that she's necessarily a likable character at all, but I really do kind of like her because she's very controversial. So this is a book that I was reading on the go. I constantly have a nonfiction on the go, and I wanted to finish this up, A, before I came to Italy, but B, before Nonfiction November, because I knew I wanted to switch over into another Roman history for Nonfiction November. I enjoyed this. I rated this 3 stars, I think. I just wish that there had been more to it. I was constantly wanting there to be a little bit more meat. Now, before coming on this vacation, we were dealing with a lot of stress. There was just a lot going on, and a lot of it very, very hard. The past month and a half has been very hectic and very difficult personally. And I decided to pick up a book that I thought would be kind of light and happy in between Booktuber reads to kind of keep me going, keep up my momentum, and help me to keep reading, basically, but also to get my mind off of things. And so I picked up Assistant to the Villain, mostly because I have been seeing so much controversy about it. Literally no review I have seen of this book has said anything positive. And this is a fantasy romance that apparently was birthed out of a series of TikToks that the author did. I hope it was the author, but I think this was a series of TikToks about like if a villain, a supervillain had an assistant, had a secretary. And so this is low stakes, this is cozy fantasy, I think you would call it. And I just want to say this is the ideal book to be reading when you have a lot going on in your life. I am not going to add to the negativity here because I personally really loved this. I thought the romance was well done. I thought it was funny. It was exactly what I needed because I wasn't really worried about anything, and I also really wasn't worried about keeping up with the plot, so to speak. If I set it down and a few days passed by, I didn't really care, and I didn't really feel like I missed anything, and I didn't think that I needed to kind of catch myself up every single time I picked up this book. So to me, it was ideal to be reading for a lot of different reasons, and I also didn't think I was going to be able to finish it before coming on this trip, and I still thought, hey, that'll be fine, because if a week or two goes by between me picking this up, I don't actually think it's going to be that big a deal. I think I could remember everything. The thing is, this is apparently going to be a series, and I thought it was going to be a standalone. And I'll say the majority of the book is low stakes. There's not a lot happening. It's just kind of kitschy and fun and cute, and it's a really cute fantasy romance. And I love, love, love the main character, but I love even more the love interest. I'm obsessed with him, and we need to see more men like him. But I'll say the first half, you're thinking, is anything going on in this? Is anything happening? What's the point? And then you kind of come to the conclusion that since this is kind of cozy fantasy, maybe nothing is going to happen, and that's okay. Well, then the second half of the book, things start to get really interesting. The plot starts to move. You start to have a lot of questions about things. It kind of ends on a cliffhanger. And that's one thing I'll say that left me kind of scratching my head, or wondering at least a little bit, why are we doing this? Because I think the opportunity was there to put some of those elements in the book earlier to kind of really get us engaged, because I think for a certain type of reader, this book will be very frustrating. And I think in a normal time, in just a regular time, this book would have been frustrating to me because of that. I think the first half you're going to feel kind of frustrated by once you read the second half and you realize that things could have been put in there beforehand. But like I said, to read something when there's a lot going on, when there's a lot of stress going on in your life, I kind of think this book was really ideal, because I think it was just enough for me. Enough was going on, and enough was keeping me engaged, particularly in terms of the characters. I really loved the characters. This to me had a Renaissance fair feel, and that's one of the highest compliments I can pay a book, is if I feel like I am at the Renaissance fair, then I'm having a great time. And this book kind of did that for me. I think it's interesting though, assistant to the villain, I kind of had in my head assistant to a supervillain and kind of a superhero type world, but this literally is a fantasy book. And there's also kind of a lower stake mystery in this. Someone is sabotaging the villain, and you're kind of wondering why. And so our main character is just kind of a nice girl who was hired by the villain to be his secretary, and she does really well at her job. But most of the jokes, of course, are, oh, he's torturing somebody, but he's really hot. And so the book does have a lot of moral quandaries that are never dealt into. I think it kind of would have been interesting for this book to be read on a different level, or to have been written maybe in mind with the idea that we were going to break down some of these tropes and some of these concepts, especially around why women in particular are attracted to villains. And I kind of thought this book was going to go there, and it never did. It just kind of played it safe, and it acknowledged the fact that women find villains attractive, but it played it for a joke all the time. And I kind of think it would have been interesting if the book had really analyzed that and talked about why that is. I think that would have been more interesting to me. But I really loved this, and I'll definitely carry on with this series, so I gave this 4 stars. A book I started reading before coming over here. I got it essentially just to read it on the plane, but that's called Disobedient by Elizabeth Fremantle, I think. This is a historical fiction about Artemisia Gentileschi. This had been on my radar for a long time. I think this is a new release. This came out this year, possibly over the summer sometime, but it is about Artemisia Gentileschi. And she was an artist of the late Renaissance, early Baroque period. She has an incredible Judith. That's really her most famous work. It's her painting of Judith slaying Holofernes, which is absolutely incredible. It hangs in the Uffizi in Florence. But her personal life is more interesting than her art because she was actually assaulted and she took him to trial. And she is actually, I think, one of the first recorded instances of a woman actually taking their assaulter to trial and winning for it. So this book mainly deals with that. Her art is kind of an afterthought. And you know, when I was reading this, throughout the course of reading this, I constantly wondered and questioned to myself what else I know her for, what other art pieces of hers are really famous. And I really was struggling to come up with something. But I'll tell you, her period of time is not the time I know the most about in terms of art. I think basically once Michelangelo has died, I have passed out of the realm of understanding in terms of art, because this is the time of Caravaggio. Caravaggio dies early in Artemisia's life, and Bernini is younger than she is, so he's just coming up. Now, I love Bernini. We could sit here and talk about Bernini for hours. I adore Bernini. But I did realize throughout the course of reading this book just how little I knew about her personally, but also how little I knew about her art. I have a lot of issues with this book. I don't think this was all that well written, all things considered. It felt like it was dealing with really heavy topics, of course. You saw her assault on page, you read her grappling with it, and then of course you read her dealing with the fact that she would potentially have to marry this man, and then she considered taking this man to court and everything. So it's really dealing with something very heavy here for the most part. It's not necessarily an art book at all. But to me, the writing of this was so juvenile. I felt like I was reading a YA book, and I'm not sure this was intended to be. I need to look it up, and in fact, I should have looked it up before recording this, because if it's YA, I don't really feel like I have room to complain about it. But if it is adult, I really have a lot of issues with the way this was written. I just don't think this was the best. I feel like there could have been a little bit more to it. And it also felt like the author was just constantly throwing in references to other artists and to other people that she would have known from the time period, which I think is valid. Cardinal Borghese, of course, because he's building up his collection at the time and he wants Bernini. I think all of that makes sense to hear, but we had multiple different perspectives in this book that we did not need, and that I think actually weakened the book structurally. But Artemisia on her own, I'm going to say this, is actually not interesting enough to carry a book on her own. The way that Elizabeth Fremantle wrote her, she was not a very interesting person. And yet you know that can't be true. But given all of the multiple perspectives, Artemisia's was the one you dreaded getting back to, and she was easily the least interesting person in the cast. And so I just think this book had a lot of problems, and I really didn't enjoy reading it. I finished it essentially because I struggled to get attached to the Wi-Fi at my hotel in Rome, and so I just finished it out of spite, basically because I had to. And I gave this one 2 stars. This was really disappointing to me. There are a lot of apparently really great Artemisia historical fictions out there, so I'm definitely going to keep my eyes open for those, and they've got to be better than this one, most certainly. A book I recently picked up and then I just automatically read, so I'm proud of myself. That's Horrid by Katrina Leno. This is a book that has been on my TBR for some years. I've been aware of it at least for a long time, and it went on a Kindle Daily deal, so I just snatched it up. But this is a YA horror book that is about a haunted house. And I feel like I'm in crunch time. I'm filming this and it's a week before Halloween, so I feel like I have to get all of my Halloween reading in, and I really exhausted it back in the summer. I read the majority of my Halloween books, horror books, I read them back in the summer. And so when I saw this go on a Kindle Daily deal, I said it's time. And I knew that reviews of this had been controversial, but I didn't really realize how controversial it was going to get. This book is very bizarre. It is about a girl and her mom moving back to her grandmother's estate in Maine, which is cool. So in a way, this is a haunted house book, and just kind of in general a house book, which I think is really cool. I love when a house is kind of a character in a story, but they moved back to Maine because her father has died. And so the book is in many ways a look at grief, and it's also in many ways a discussion of mental health. And I mention this because that kind of throws the events of the entire novel into chaos for me, because you kind of don't know if what happened actually happened at all. You don't know how much of this book is real and how much of it is taking place in the characters' heads. And normally I would say that's something I kind of like, and I think that's a weirdness that I'm really attracted to in novels. I like to be unsure, and I like sometimes to be tricked, but it's not all the time. And I'll tell you this is my honest opinion on all haunted house books. And I know as I say this now, you will know whenever I review a haunted house book in future, how I feel is probably gonna kind of spoil what the book is. But I don't actually like to be tricked in a haunted house story at all. I want there to be ghosts. I want the house to be haunted. And if you tell me that it's all happening in someone's head, or even if that's just a possibility, which is kind of what this book was, you were left with a lot of questions. What happened? Was it meaningful? Was it real? That's one thing, and that can work for me at times, but I don't like it when we Scooby-Doo it. I don't want it to be a real person. Do not do that to me. Do not do that to me. I want it to be ghosts. And so this book didn't do that, but it did kind of leave you questioning everything. Throughout the book, you had questions, and you thought maybe the end would resolve this, and maybe in some ways it did, but in some ways it didn't. And so I was really frustrated by this the entire time. And I think it just wasn't for me. Let's be honest, I don't think this one was for me. And I've had this complaint in the past with YA horror. I just don't know if I'm someone who could really get into young adult horror books. And I feel like just in general, I have struggled with horror lately, and I'm really hard on something that calls itself a haunted house story. This was my first Katrina Leno, and I've heard a lot of people talk about her style of writing. She really doesn't work for some people. She really does work for others. And so I'd be interested to try her again, but let's just say I'm glad this was on a Kindle Daily Deal. I really did not take to this at all. So I feel like I need to read something else to kind of rescue the Halloween season for me, because I feel like basically everything that I read for Halloween this year in terms of horror, it just wasn't all that. It just wasn't that great. I think these four were the main four books that I have not talked about elsewhere. I don't think I have spoken about them in any other videos, but specifically I did not vlog them. So I really just wanted to do a video where I mentioned them. It's been a chaotic few reading months. I have been very up and down. It seems like the first 6 months of the year, I was just having a banger of a reading year, and I was reading more 5 stars than I ever had previously. I think the second half of the year, I have really slowed down on that. Not that I've read really bad books, but I think I have been more disappointed than I have really loved anything. Nothing is really sticking out to me as a true favorite of the year. Since July, I really don't feel like I have read a book I'm going to consider a favorite of the year. So that's kind of disappointing. And I feel like I'm especially disappointed this year in terms of Halloween reads. But I have read some great books while I've been on vacation, and so I've done a reading vlog there. And some of them have had the Halloween vibe, or at the very least, kind of an autumn spooky kind of vibe. So that's really helped me get into the season. But I feel like we're basically at the end here, and then we're gonna have to start thinking about end of year stats, which is very crazy. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.